This sort of begs the question, why? Why, Ansel, you're from the South, you're not Jewish, you didn't grow up in a Jewish community, African American. What was the connection? You grew up in a Christian home. What was it that motivated you to get involved in this struggle? And so, being raised in the household of a preacher, of course, I was familiar with the Jewish story. I was familiar with the story of the Jewish people, how they were, just as African Americans, how they were enslaved. I was familiar with the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, how they were promised to be established as a people in their homeland of Israel, and how they were enslaved just as we were, and how they were exiled from their land in 3 exiles, first by the Assyrians, then by the Babylonians, then by the Romans. And how in their exile, in the Jewish diasporic experiences, how they were marginalized and demonized and dehumanized in the same way that we as Africans in our diasporic experiences were marginalized, demonized, and dehumanized. But I also knew that the Jewish people had reconstituted themselves as a sovereign people in their homeland of Israel. And as an African American, this inspired me. And so when I heard the rhetoric that was being spewed by Justice for Palestine, I recognized it as a morally and historically bankrupt narrative. And so as I began to examine the ties between our communities, Africans and Jewish communities around the world, I have discovered that the ties and the bonds are deep and they are enduring. And so that's what I would like to talk with you about today: the common bonds of peoplehood and faith, the common trials of homeland and diaspora, and the common lessons of subjugation and sovereignty. So let's start with the common bonds of peoplehood and faith. So let me just say this. There's been much discussion about the common ties that that Black Americans, Africans, and Jews have in the common adversities and trials that we have had to overcome. But the ties and the bonds between us go much deeper than that. Our ties of kinship go back into antiquity. And it's quite natural given the geographic, cultural, political, sociological proximity of Israel and Africa. Some geographers would even say that Israel is a part of Africa, that Israel is in Africa. We'll save that for another discussion. But the ties are deep and they are ancient. So for instance, let's take the Torah, the Jewish Torah. What I think we could say there's probably a consensus has served as the constitution of Jewish identity and self-expression through the centuries, through the millennia even. Okay, it has been a cohesive force of Jewish resilience throughout the ages. So when you look to the Torah and you look to the traditional author, the self-identified author of the Torah, it's who? Moses, right? So let's examine for a moment the life of Moses in the Torah narrative. Moses in the Torah narrative is raised as an African in the Egyptian house of Pharaoh. And yes, Egypt is Africa and the Egyptians were Africans. So Moses was raised as an African. And being raised as an African, quite naturally, who does he marry? He marries an Ethiopian African wife, a matrimony which, by the way, is affirmed and zealously defended in the Torah. And when Moses leads the people of Israel out of bondage and slavery in the Torah narrative to be established as a nation in the land of African Canaanites, we see that Moses goes up with a mixed company of Africans. And so what you see in essence in the Torah story, in this fundamental, foundational constitution of Jewish identity, in the very formative years of the Jewish people, what you see is that in essence, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel as a collective, was essentially birthed out of Africa. And these deep ties and connections between the Jewish people and Africans it's recorded. It was recognized by the Jewish prophets. So for instance, if I can give you a reference, the Jewish prophet Amos Amos chapter 9, verse 7. If you can't take it from Reverend Brown, then we'll hear it from the prophet Amos. Amos chapter 9, verse 7. Are you not as the sons of Ethiopia to me, O sons of Israel, declares the Lord? Have I not brought up Israel from the land of Egypt? That's in the Jewish scripture, Amos chapter 9, verse 7. You could look to other passages, Isaiah chapter 19, we'll start with 19, in reference to Egypt, African Egypt. In that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord near its borders. And it will become a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts, in the land of Egypt. For they will cry to the Lord because of the oppressors, and he will send them a savior and a champion, and he will deliver them. Thus the Lord will make himself known to Egypt. And the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day. They will even worship with sacrifice and offering, and will make a vow to the Lord and perform it. The Lord will strike Egypt, striking but healing. So they will return to the Lord, and he will respond to them and will heal them. And it picks up in verse 24. In that day Israel will be the third party with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed is Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance. So you see these ties and these connections in Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 38 and 39, he predicts the exile of the Jewish people when the Babylonians had besieged, when Nebuchadnezzar had besieged Jerusalem, and the destruction of the lower kingdom of Judah was imminent. And so Jeremiah predicts that there's going to be an exile, that the Jewish people will not withstand the besiegement of the Babylonians. And this didn't land so well. This didn't go over well. And so Jeremiah finds himself abandoned in a cistern. And so the story goes that there's a man named Ebed-Melech who rescues Jeremiah. Ebed-Melech was an Ethiopian. He was an Ethiopian Israeli. So this idea of the connection between Ethiopia, Africa, and Israel goes back into antiquity. It was an Ethiopian Israeli who rescues Jeremiah. And so there's a special blessing and a promise to Ebed-Melech that he would be rescued in the sort of wake of the imminent exile and destruction of the Jewish people as a political organization, as a political sort of a reality in Judah. And so on this note, I want to talk a little bit about the African Jewish communities that emerged during this first exilic experience. The first community that I want to mention is the community in Egypt. Arguably, one might say that the Jewish community in Egypt was the center of Jewish life, the most significant center of Jewish life outside of Israel during the exile. There was a vast Jewish community in Alexandria where Jewish texts were drafted, collected. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, was drafted in Alexandria. There were communities in what would be present-day Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania. So fast forward to the 20th century, from 1948 to 1967, roughly between 600 and it's actually more than that, between 700 and 800,000 North African Jews of African origin, were forced out of their homes by Arab governments antagonistic and hostile to the state of Israel. So today, in the state of Israel, you have a huge North African Jewish community. And on this note, I want to address something that you often hear in the sort of anti-Israel BDS rhetoric, that Israel is this white colonist settler occupation state. I believe a previous speaker mentioned that the Middle Eastern population of Israel is almost half of the population. Well, if you include African Jews from North Africa, and I'm going to talk about Ethiopian Jews, the majority of the Jewish population in Israel is actually from the Middle East and Africa, and not white Ashkenazi. That's important to note. And the 20% of the Israeli Arab population, by the way, they have full civil rights. It's an insult to say the Israeli Arabs are living under segregation, apartheid. It's an insult to those of us who actually experience that. And so that's the North Africa. And then you have the Ethiopian Jewish community. My wife actually is Ethiopian Jewish, but you have the Ethiopian Jewish community. Today there are approximately 135,000 Ethiopian Israelis who have Israeli citizenship. And then you have another 100, and they were actually rescued. They were brought to Israel in two operations, Operation Moses and Operation Solomon. And then you have another 150,000 or so Ethiopian Jews who are still in Ethiopia. And then there are, of course, many around the world. But you have another 150,000 Ethiopian Jews who are still in Ethiopia, a community called the Beit Abraham community, the Kecheni Jews, primarily in Addis Ababa, but scattered throughout the country of Ethiopia. And this group of Ethiopian Jews have had to largely go underground. It's what we would call a crypto-Jewish community. They've had to go largely underground in their Jewish worship practice as a result of persecution from the Orthodox Christian Church in Ethiopia, much in the same way that the Marranos in Spain and the Sephardic community had to go underground with their Jewish identity. So we have a little over 250,000 Ethiopian Jews. And then moving down the continent into Zimbabwe and South Africa, there are 80,000 Black African Limba Jews who trace their lineage to the Ethiopian community. Their narrative, their tradition is that they migrated from Yemen into Ethiopia and then they branched off from the Ethiopian Jewish community and made their way into Zimbabwe and South Africa. So interestingly, this community, there have been some genetic studies that actually corroborates and confirms their story. Many of the men in the Limba community share the genetic marker called the Cohen marker that many Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish men also have. And then there are other communities. There are the Igbos in Nigeria, in southeastern Nigeria. Of course, this community is a community of millions, but today there are estimates of around about 30,000 who are practicing Judaism. And they assert that they have Jewish heritage. And by the way, interestingly, the Igbo Jews were recognized. The Igbo Jews were recognized by the British when the British colonized Nigeria. If you look over here to this, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. If you look over here to this flag of the sort of the Nigerian the Nigerian British colonial flag, you'll see the Star of David. And this is because the British recognized that the Igbo had Jewish heritage. It was recognized by the British when they colonized Nigeria. And then you have other communities. We've had a conversation with one of our scholars here who is from Ghana. There is a substantial community in Ghana, the Ashanti. There's one specific community called Sefwi Wiesel in Ghana, the House of Israel. And then there are other communities in Tanzania and all throughout the continent of Africa. And this is not to mention the 100,000 plus Jews in North America, in the United States, and in Canada who have African heritage. So you have all of these deep, deep ties between African and Jewish communities. And I think on this note, I think it's a nice segue. I want to talk a little bit about the role of the Jewish story as a point of inspiration to the African American experience. I want to go back to that story of Moses. Throughout the decades, African Americans, and I would say even probably centuries, African Americans were inspired by the Jewish story. They were inspired by the story of the Jewish people being enslaved and being liberated and being established as a people in their land of promise. You could look at Harriet Tubman, for instance. Who did the people refer to Harriet Tubman as? They referred to her as Moses. And you see this in the spirituals, right? Go down, Moses. Go down into Egypt. Tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. We were inspired by the Jewish story of the people of Israel being liberated from bondage and going into their land of promise. You could go on and on. Black churches oftentimes took the names of geographic locations in the Hebrew scriptures. Mount Moriah Missionary Baptist Church, Mount Nebo United Methodist, Mount Zion Church, right? And by the way, this idea of Zion in the African diaspora community had the same meaning. It took on the same meaning as it did in the Jewish community.
My first year at college, BDS was coming up on campus, and I was having a conversation after an event with a student who was a member of Students for Justice for Palestine. A very calm conversation, because he was consistently interrupting our speaker, which I found extremely disrespectful. So after the fact, I wanted to actually have a conversation with him. And I brought up the fact, I asked him, because he's throwing out buzzwords, trying to say that struggles in Israel are the exact parallels of struggles of black people in the United States. Keep in mind, this is not a black student, nor a Jewish student. I don't know what authority he has to speak on this, but he believes he has an authority to speak on this. I asked him, what is your opinion on the way that black people are treated in Gaza and the West Bank, many of whom do share a history of enslavement and who are descendants of the Arab slave trade the same way my family is descendants of the European slave trade? His response was, I don't really know much about that, and to be honest, I don't talk about it because it's not convenient. So for me to hear that a non-black, non-Jewish student, not a member of any of these communities, believes that something that's deeply affected so many people, where black people have told their stories of being in Gaza or being in the West Bank, where they're referred to as abid, which is a racialized slur that means slave. You know, as someone who's been called the N-word, as someone who's been called a variety of racial slurs, to hear that no one is going to highlight that struggle because it's not convenient and doesn't fit into that narrative was extremely offensive to me. So I tried to explain this to him, and I told him, my struggle is not a bargaining chip for you to use. I 100% support black Israelis, Ethiopian Israelis' struggles for justice and to get rid of discrimination, as I know many other Israelis do. That's part of being part of the nation of Israel. I completely support the struggles of my people in the United States, in North America, throughout the world, struggling for justice, whether it's in Israel, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in the West Bank, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Libya. But to hear that someone is just going to ignore that and is so blatant to say that they don't talk about it because it's not convenient, and then they have the nerve to the next week when the BDS hearing comes in line to question me and start asking me what I think about Black Lives Matter, when they clearly don't care about Black lives unless they fit into their own political agenda, was extremely problematic. And what was more problematic was when I tried to explain this to him, rather than having a conversation, he said, you know, I'm not getting anywhere with you, so I'm going to leave. So I think that goes to show how this anti-Semitism and appropriation of other narratives to attack Jews in Israel and appropriation of issues going on in Israel and things that affect the Jewish people are used to attack other political opponents kind of shows that for many people on campus, they either have an ignorance of Jewish history, of Jewish culture, and they don't necessarily understand that we're not just political bargaining chips, and we actually are still alive. We've survived the Holocaust, we've survived the Farhud, we've survived the expulsions, and these are elements of our history that we're living with and that affected us. So we need to be able to speak for ourselves and not just have other people use us for their narratives.
I take a much different approach to this. I appreciate these intellectuals and their perspective. As a college administrator at a university, I'm more of a practitioner in my day-to-day. And I consider myself a quasi-intellectual. And the reason I say that is because just like most people I talk to on the campus, I can look at the information, I can take in the information, but as a quasi-intellectual, I can be emotionally charged and I can ignore the facts. Because that's what most people do. No matter what the facts are, they interpret it and they disregard what they don't like. And so when we talk about intersectionality, one of the things that I did as I was coming here is I talked to several different people, some friends, some not, some formally educated and some not. And as I talked to them about the Jewish experience, the African American, whether it's a woman or sexual identity, they were all passionate about their experiences. And what I've learned working on a college campus as I've dealt with students and student organizations or individual students, whatever they're going through, whatever their suffrage is, that's the most important and impactful suffrage that's happening in the world. And as we talk about intersectionality, it causes people to have to acknowledge that we've all gone through something, and what you went through is what I went through isn't as significant as what you went through. And what I was trying to figure out is, why is this notion, this rejection of intersectionality between Jews and African Americans or black people or others, why is there resistance? And from what I could ascertain as a quasi-intellectual is that when we admit that there's intersectionality, we admit that someone may have gone through something as devastating as what I've gone through. And as I talk to many African Americans, when we talk about slavery, there's nothing more horrific than slavery that a people could have endured. And that's from people, whether they're intellectual or not, nothing can be worse than that. But as I've talked to some of my Jewish friends and colleagues, when they talk about their experience, nothing could be worse than what they went through. Nothing. And so once we come together and can decide that one doesn't trump the other, that we all went through something, we can have intersectionality. But until we get to that point, it's all about what I've gone through. And one of the things I realized in higher education, and I came through student affairs, and many student affairs administrators, and if anyone is in higher ed and works in student affairs here, they work all the time. They work day and night, they're always on the campus. And one of the things I would say to them is they always complain about how much they work and that they work when no one else is working and their experience is so much tougher and they get paid less. And I talk to them and I say, many of them, I say, get off the cross. Because all of them want to get on the cross and say, what I endure is so much more insignificant than any other worker on the campus. And so when we look at a lot of these situations and the identity behind them, it's about who went through the most. It's not, and it's emotional when you start talking to people about the history that they've endured and you start to interpret it and the facts go out the window. Because it's emotionally charged. And so as we do this work, we have to get to a point which is very challenging, particularly when you're working with students. When a student comes into my office and they're upset and they're emotional, I can state all the facts, I can state the policies, I can state everything, but they're not moved by that. The only thing they know is, I've been wronged, something's happened to me, and I want you to do something about it. And I don't care what the rules are, I don't care what the policies are, I want you to do something about it, and I want you to know what you're going to do to the people. And if you know anything about the rules of a university with FERPA, you can't discuss how you resolve cases, even with the injured. But the injured wants to know that someone suffered for what happened to them. And so as we talk about a lot of these issues, we have to be cognizant that there's a dichotomy that exists. And whether we want to accept it or not, there are two sides, or more than two sides, to every situation that we discuss. So what we have to do is start engaging people to the point where we can acknowledge their suffrage, but at the same time getting them to acknowledge the suffrage of other people. And one thing, and I'll be brief with mine, one thing I know is I've worked in some challenging environments and I've worked at some universities with some very privileged students. And one of the things I noticed from the students who had great privilege is, if they had an issue or they felt they were suffering, no matter how minor I may have thought it was, to them it was the most important thing in their life. And I could trivialize it, but for them, it was as significant as what any other student was going through. And that's kind of how I believe from my observations that people think. What you go through is significant to you. And it may be small to another person and they can outsuffer you with what they've gone through. But what we go through in our minds is real. And we have to acknowledge that. And once we can acknowledge that people believe what they've gone through is significant and their suffrage is real, and I'm not going to compare my suffrage to theirs, but I can acknowledge that they're suffering, I think we can get to a point of intersectionality, but it doesn't have to be the same. But most of the times we want it to be the same, or we want to say, well, I was a slave, well, I was a slave too. Well, I lost my land, well, I lost my land too. Well, I did this, well, I did too. But you didn't have to go, you didn't do that. But the reality, it doesn't matter. It's that we've all gone through something and we have to acknowledge it.
Just as Africans had to fight for the right to self-determination, sovereignty, and liberty, so also the Jewish people had to fight for their right to self-determination, sovereignty, and liberty. Just as Africans were subjugated by European culture, we were culturally subjugated by European societies, so also the Jewish people were subjugated culturally by European societies. Just as Africans, whether that be in the continent of Africa or in the African diaspora, we were the victims of demonization, we were stereotyped, we were scapegoated, we were considered social pariahs and a threat to society, so also our Jewish brothers and sisters, they were demonized, they were subjugated, they were stereotyped, they were considered social pariahs and a threat to society. And so as I looked and made these observations, I asked myself, why? Why can we not just be? Why everywhere we exist, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in the United Kingdom, whether it's in France, Asia, Africa, why are African people and Jewish people, people of African and Jewish heritage, always maligned, always hated, always the victims of bigotry? And so what I want to do, Charles, if you allow me, I just want to take just a moment to read a couple of paragraphs from a paper that I recently presented at the Racialization and Publicness Conference here at Oxford University that I think may shed some light on this question. And if nothing else, I believe it will be some food for thought for our conversation this afternoon. There's a consistent psychology behind the ethnic alienation of Africans and Jews throughout history. Revisiting the Moses narrative in the Jewish Torah, the psychosis behind this oppression is strikingly manifest. In the recorded story of Israeli bondage in Egypt, the Jewish male babies were killed by the Egyptians who feared that, and I'll quote from the passage from Exodus. The people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than me. And that's an important phrase. That's really going at what I'm getting at, right? So this was the Egyptians. There's a precursor of the oppression of the Jewish people, the bondage of the Jewish people in Egypt. The people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. So I want to expound upon what I'm seeing in this text. It gives us some insight as to what's going on with racism and anti-Semitism. In the timeless wisdom of this text, the psychology of supremacy and cultural subjugation is exposed as what I believe to be fundamentally fear and the social ills that emanate from this fear: envy, demonization, and ultimately oppression and other genocidal outcomes. The onslaught to debase and dehumanize Africans and Jews historically has been fueled by deep-seated societal insecurity. Dominant societies have been keen on their own irrational sense of fragility and observation of the resilience that has sustained Jewish and African communities. Caleb Myers notes in his book, Critical Alliance, African Americans, Jews, and the Middle East Conundrum, that the chutzpah, or nerve, and I would add even strength, of African American and Jewish communities to stand and thrive against all odds is a common characteristic, one that, in my view, has unnerved dominant societies. Dominant societies, in essence, have sought to undermine the self-realization of those they perceive as threatening to their own sense of security. The irrational fear towards Africans has been that they pose a threat to the population of the dominant societies, while the fear of Jews has been that they pose a threat to the power of dominant societies. Not surprisingly, white supremacists habitually attack people of African and Jewish heritage together as an amalgamate threat to white dominance. These ethnic phobias and bigotries are deeply rooted in psychological complexes of inferiority, masked and inverted as superiority. The dominant societies have taken this position to externally stabilize an underlying internal psychosis of perceived weakness. These dangerous perceptions must be overcome by safeguarding the sovereignty of African and Jewish communities to preserve their vitality and optimally contribute to the common good of society, contrary to these false constructions. So essentially what I'm saying here, and I know there's been some discussion about the distinctiveness of African and Jewish struggle against the trials and adversities that we have overcome. I think the analogy is that anti-Semitism is punching up and racism is punching down. Well, I want to add a layer to that to say that I believe a punch is a punch, right? So whether it's a right hook, left hook, uppercut, or jab, I believe that there is a commonality in the fundamental motivation of the punch, and that is this, that anytime you see oppression in our world, whether that's at a domestic level, whether that's at a social level, whether that's at a national, international, political level, I believe that there is always an inferiority complex or a fear and insecurity that is masking as superiority. And I think Dr. King recognized this in his brilliant letter from a Birmingham jail when he talked about the sickness of Southern segregationist society. So in essence, what I'm saying is that I don't believe people of African and Jewish heritage have been persecuted because of what is wrong with us. Although, of course, we do know that there are quite a few things within our communities that need to be addressed. But I believe we have been persecuted because of what has been perceived as being right about us. I don't believe we've been bullied because we are weak. I believe we have been bullied because we are strong, and our strength has been a perceived threat to those who have bullied us. So I think we have quite a bit to work with. I believe we need to stand together with fortitude, with resoluteness, and with solidarity to essentially fight and to eradicate the blight of racism and anti-Semitism in our world. And with that, I will hand over the microphone to my colleagues, and I look forward to the conversation.